The reserve is broken into 17 different blocks. Some of them are hunting blocks, some of them are conservation blocks, and 2 of them are protected areas.
The Niassa Reserve is situated in the far north of Mozambique, with the Rovuma River forming the borderline with Tanzania. It is the biggest wildlife sanctuary in the country, covering an area of about 16,200 square miles, which is about the size of Switzerland. Although it was proclaimed in 1954 as the country's first game reserve, it had no formal protection until recently. The country was plunged into war in 1964, and during the long period of conflict, northern Mozambique was largely depopulated as local communities fled to the safety of neighboring countries.
The whole reserve had suffered from a fairly high level of poaching. And because there were just no resources up here, the animals were used to feed the armies, feed some of the plantations.
Peace finally came in 1992. The government realized that the people would return to the Niassa, so it was essential to put in a sound management plan to protect the area's wilderness while recognizing crucial human needs. A Norwegian businessman, Halvor Astrup, was instrumental in rehabilitating the Niassa Reserve. He recognized the reserve's inherent potential whilst flying over the area during the Civil War. At a time when most of the country's conservation areas were significantly devastated, wildlife numbers, especially elephants, appeared to be relatively healthy. After the end of the war, Astrup became involved in negotiations with the government to demarcate the reserve's boundaries, formulate a management plan, and establish the revolutionary concept of a public-private management company to administer the reserve. SGDRN, headed by Anabela Rodriguez, was the private company contracted by the government until 2012, when the Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS, took over. Astrup paid to establish the basic infrastructure and the day-to-day running of the reserve. He invested a lot of his personal wealth into development, but realized that for the project to work, it had to be self-sustaining.
In the early planning, the concept was to have hunting blocks as a buffer zone around a core area of the reserve. But everybody quickly realized that actually a large proportion of the buffer zone was actually the most viable, productive country in the reserve. A lot of these blocks were bordering the Lifeblood River, which is largely the lifeblood of Niassa. So that concept was changed, and we are part of the main Niassa Reserve.
It was understood from the start that it would be difficult to run photographic safaris until wildlife populations were rehabilitated and the reserve's infrastructure developed. However, wildlife numbers were stable enough to conduct hunting safaris.
The reserve is broken into 17 different blocks. Some of them are hunting blocks, some of them are conservation blocks, and 2 of them are protected areas, the Yao Mountain and Makula Mountain. The blocks have all been put out to public tender. One of the most insightful things that the Mozambican government did was to give long-term leases, which has meant that the people who have been involved have bought in fully to investing and trying to develop and secure these incredibly beautiful and big blocks. The leases came with certain obligations, which included employing a certain number of people from the local communities, developing infrastructure, which included roads, safari camps, airstrips, and so forth. The leaseholders are basically given the responsibility of running the blocks to some extent as standalone wildlife entities. We call ourselves Luweri, the Lugenda Wildlife Reserve, and we try to run the whole block as a reserve with anti-poaching, community work, and some safari work to generate commercial revenues. The block itself is 200 kilometers from one end to the other, over 1 million acres. When we arrived here, I came in with Jamie Wilson. There were no roads, no camps, no infrastructure at all. The first 2 or 3 years were really frenetic. We put in about 1,500 kilometers of roads, put in 3 safari camps, started running safaris to generate revenue. Later in 2006, 2007, we built the Lugenda camp, which was the first photographic offering in the reserve. The idea was to transition from your traditional pioneering hunting safaris to a mix and a balance of photographic safaris. Unfortunately, the logistics and one thing and another have meant that it's never really gained traction, and we now realize that the ideal model is a far lower footprint adventure tourism type model. The vegetation type here is classified as Miombo woodland. We are fortunate enough to have a lot of very diverse and different ecotones within that. We have miles and miles of incredible riparian forest. Into that mix, we have these very beautiful granite enselbergs that stick out of these forests. You have a lot of beautiful hardwoods, big trees, and the game that's associated with those. Further to that, you have huge dambos. We call them pantanals here, big open grass flays that the zebra, the hartebeest, sable, and so on utilize, and then palm flats that generally are unparalleled to the riverine belts. We have nearly 300 kilometers of incredibly beautiful Lugenda River frontage down the northern border of the block. It's still one of the pristine waterways of Africa. It's an amazing privilege, but also a big challenge and a commitment to protect that, to keep it safe. The river is used by local fishermen. The fishing is actually a very important part of the traditional economy here. It's not overfished. The resources are still very solid. The hippo and crocodile populations are growing year on year, as are most of the game populations across the whole block.